In this video, I will be performing the 8th Prelude from the first book of Preludes by Claude Debussy. We usually refer to this prelude by the title Debussy gave it, La fille aux cheveux de lin, or translated in English as The Girl with the Flaxen Hair. However, it is important to realize that Debussy had the titles for all of his preludes printed at the end of each piece, enclosed in parentheses and preceded by an ellipsis. These titles, therefore, were not meant to be seen before listening to or playing the piece, but rather after the piece had already been performed or listened to, just like an afterthought. Here's what this actually looks like in the score. What you see, by the way, right now is the first edition, which was published in 1910 by Dulcken. Here is the beginning of the piece. And here now you see the end of the piece with the title in parentheses and the ellipsis. This suggestion, rather than outright statement of the title, may seem like a sign of Debussy's indebtedness to Impressionism, which is how we tend to categorize him nowadays. However, I think the matter is a little less clear-cut. Debussy himself disliked the term Impressionism, preferring instead the term Symbolism. This is indeed an important distinction. While symbolism may be difficult to define precisely, its fundamental characteristic is what James Kugel has expressed as a reliance upon techniques of strangeness. This strangeness is created not by abandoning conventions, but rather by making conventional devices function in unconventional, strange ways, placing them within unfamiliar contexts, or combining them in unusual ways. While symbolism is associated primarily with poetry and literature, we can apply the aesthetic to music as well. And were I to simplify a bit, I'd say we can detect the influence of symbolism on Debussy in that his music seems to contain many of the familiar tropes of tonality, and yet sounds distinctly different from traditional tonal music, since functional tonality, which is dependent on particular chord progressions for its identity, is not always present in Debussy's music. Which means that Debussy does not abandon tonality, he just makes it function in strange ways. A lot of these techniques are also applicable in this prelude, even if this is arguably one of the more conventional preludes in the collection. Before we continue, let me briefly say that I am playing this piece in F major rather than its original tonality of G flat major, and I will explain later why. So, if for instance we look at the beginning of the piece, you will notice that it does not start with the tonic chord. Instead, it starts with a 6th chord with an added 7th. So the very beginning is this. And all of this is just... And while this is not such an unheard of move, especially by the beginning of the 20th century, it is interesting that Debussy then proceeds to approach the tonic via a subdominant chord, so that the total effect is that he starts away from the tonic and establishes it with a less standard progression of a plagal cadence. So what we have is, if I were to just play the chords, in other words, even within a fairly simple context, Debussy is still trying to find subtle ways to obscure the perception of the tonic, or to put it another way, chooses a less obvious way of establishing the tonic. Another strategy Debussy employs here is the use of streams of parallel fifths and octaves. Anyone who has taken music theory knows that these parallels are forbidden in tonal music. And while there are cases where they may occasionally appear in the work of tonal composers, their effect is to weaken tonal progressions and thus our perception of tonality. One of the reasons for this is that without the third of the chord, we can never know whether we're dealing with a major or a minor triad. In other words, if I play even an F chord and I just do F, C, or F, C, F, is this a major chord or a minor chord? We don't know because everything depends on whether I play this or so what happens is that we end up with a series of chords whose identity we are unsure of and which frustrate the musical grammar of functional tonality, which, as I mentioned previously, is dependent on specific chord progressions. Add to this the occasional use of modal rather than tonal patterns, including elements of pentatonicism, and you have a list of elements that can work against conventional tonality. So despite that, in this prelude especially, we never actually have any overtly dissonant chords or harmonies or anything really that appears too much out of the ordinary. The context in which these normal elements are presented still manages to be somewhat strange. And now onto the transcription. Let's start with the most obvious discrepancy, which is my decision to transpose the piece down a semitone from G flat major to F major. In some respects, this could be seen as a practical solution. The highest note in the piece, which is part of the final sonority, is a high G flat, which is not a note available on my harpsichord, which goes up to an F, a semitone below that G flat. I could have simply tuned that F a semitone higher, but I decided against it for two reasons. First, by transposing an F major, I could use the entire range of the harpsichord from its lowest note to its highest note. Then there was the issue of temperament. While it is highly unlikely Debussy would be thinking in terms of equal temperament, and in this case it would be interesting to explore what kind of color associations he would have had in mind with the tonality he chose. It is even more unlikely that he would be thinking in terms of the Rameau temperament I used here. However, considering that I am performing the piece on a harpsichord, I felt this temperament could help to bring out the character of the piece, which Debussy instructs should be very calm and gently expressive. This is because this temperament contains 4 pure major thirds, which sound much calmer than the very wide thirds of equal temperament. As one of these pure major thirds is between the notes F and A, so the tonic chord, what this means is that the tonic triad has a very calm quality, which I thought was very important. And gently expressive is a good description of what F major sounds like in the Rameau temperament anyway. Anytime we perform a piece on a different instrument than what it was written for, we have to make certain concessions. This is, of course, something that also happens when harpsichord music is performed on the piano. It's just that we are so used to hearing it this way, and a lot of performers and listeners are not familiar with the conventions of Baroque performance practice, that oftentimes these concessions go unnoticed. The challenge for me was to render the very calm and gently expressive quality that Debussy has so artfully suggested with his intimate knowledge of the capabilities of the piano, and especially the piano he would have had been familiar with, which is a bit different from the modern grand. But let's not introduce too many controversial issues in one video. Achieving a very calm and gently expressive quality on a harpsichord is quite easy, but not in the way this piece is written, since harpsichords and pianos have very different capabilities. One of the main obstacles here is the chordal writing. As I have said in previous videos, the harpsichord is an instrument where expressive nuances and dynamic contrasts depend very much on how one utilizes its resonance. And the thick chords in this piece, while they can be played softly and be carefully voiced on a piano, on a harpsichord they simply accentuate the resonance, especially when they follow one another at a pace where I have no time to even arpeggiate them in various ways and thus soften their effect. So I had to compensate in various ways. The first, as I mentioned above, was to use a temperament containing pure major thirds. The second was to leave out certain notes in some of the chords, especially when dealing with octaves where a note is simply doubled. Thinning out the texture this way also helped me connect chords better, as any legato effect is entirely dependent on proper fingering. Harpsichords, of course, don't have a sustaining pedal. Finally, I adopted a slower tempo than Debussy's metronome marking of quarter note equals 66. Playing the piece a little more slowly gave me time to engage in varying forms of arpeggiation, which allowed me to soften the effect of many of the chords and achieve subtle gradations of dynamics. This way I could also emphasize the expressive, luxuriant quality of some of the harmonies. Incidentally, am I the only one that hears a very strong relationship between this passage and Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition, especially the opening promenade and the Great Gate of Kiev? As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.